Okay, so all of our fantastic money theory talk that we did today about the silver and the bimetallism and all that stuff, getting really into it, got me thinking about the Federal Reserve. And whenever I think about the Federal Reserve, which is not quite often, to be honest, I think about Woodrow Wilson. And I thought I would make a quick progressive era video on Woodrow Wilson and his domestic policy. So Woodrow Wilson is mostly known for what he is going to do in effect to World War I, right? But he also is known as a progressive era president. How progressive he in fact is, little p, we will discuss. But he is somebody who is going to have his domestic policy going as well. So we have already now talked about Teddy Roosevelt. And now we already have talked about Taft, so next up is going to be Woodrow Wilson, and we are going to discuss him right here, save ourselves a little time. And of course, you have your test coming up, so we got it all going on. All right, so Woodrow Wilson we know is going to come into office because of a split in the Republican Party. And think about it as, Teddy Roosevelt running on his own probably would have won, but also William Howard Taft is running, and they are from the same party. So now their party votes are going to be split. Whose votes are not split whatsoever? Definitely going to be Woodrow Wilson. He gets the entire Democratic Party behind him. And I'm referring to the election of 1912. So in the election of 1912, Taft runs as a regular Republican, and then you have now his old friend, but now bitter foe, Teddy Roosevelt, running as a progressive Republican, also as a bull moose. That was the nickname for the party. And then against a very good, strong, smart Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson. And think about it like the election of 1860. The more people we have, the more the votes splinter. And the more those votes splinter within a party, then that other party is going to have so much more of a shot, right? So if, I am running against, oh my gosh, Demi Lovato, and we're two very different people, obviously. And then The Weeknd jumps in, and he is also running in this candidacy. Probably a lot of people that like Demi Lovato also like The Weeknd, and obviously I just have so many votes going for me. So those votes would be split because that similar demographic that would be voting for Lovato or The Weeknd would be split, but I just get to keep all my votes because clearly we don't run in the same circles, right? So that's what's going on. Those votes get split between Taft and between Teddy Roosevelt in the Republican Party. They do not get split in the Democratic Party, and because of that, you're going to see Woodrow Wilson win. Even if he wasn't a good candidate, mathematically his odds are fantastic, but he's also a strong candidate on top of it, right? So he easily wins. Teddy Roosevelt is going to do respectably here, and Taft is going to get the least number of votes of any incumbent president ever in history. And of course, incumbent means you were previously the president, now you're running again. Oh, Taft. We're going to talk about him a lot in class. So Wilson is going to take office, and his spin when he takes office, his domestic policy, he gives it a nickname. It's called New Freedom. And it sounds pretty progressive, and basically it's just filling all the holes that Taft left. It's really easy to campaign and say you're going to fix the things that Taft did, because lots of people were not satisfied with him. So people thought that Taft wasn't tough enough on, banking reform, and the Panic of 1893 happened, and people were scared about that. In comes Woodrow Wilson with that big banking reform, and of course that's going to be the Federal Reserve. The Payne-Aldrich tariff, the whole issue with Taft there, he comes in and he lowers the tariff, which is exactly what people want. And then, of course, Taft was not thought to be as strict on monopolies and trust as Teddy Roosevelt was. So Wilson comes in and he says, I'm going to be super tough on them. So he's filling that all in. Something to keep in mind about Woodrow Wilson, he is a Southerner. And he's not just any Southerner, he's a Southerner at this time, which means that he grew up hearing all the stories about the Civil War. He grew up hearing about how they lost, and he has grown up in a Jim Crow era South, right? So keep that in mind when we talk about truly his progressive legacy and how it definitely is wanting, in my opinion. So the first thing he does, again, lowers that tariff. The Underwood Tariff Act is going to be passed. The Payne-Aldrich tariff under Taft, I remember because it's a pain in the butt because it's super high. And the Underwood tariff is going under, it's lowering, right? So again, this is pushed in Congress, and because of his persuasion, the Underwood tariff is going to be passed under Woodrow Wilson in 1913. This reduces the tariff, which is good for the customer, because we don't want to have to pay more on goods if we don't have to. But now the government's out of money. So they had that money from the tariff. How are they going to get it back? Cha-ching, income tax. We know that Taft had started this, and Woodrow Wilson is going to make this official. He compensates for that loss by adding income tax, making it an official amendment, and that's going to happen. So then also he's going to reform banks. And when he reforms the banks, We need that reform because ever since the panic of 1893, people were nervous, right? People were nervous. What if the banks close again? What's going to happen? All of this. And they wanted to keep their money out of the bank. He needs to get a way for people to trust the banks and to make sure, as we talked about, that our money doesn't get clogged anywhere, that it's a flexible money supply at all times. Keep those banks open, keep the economy afloat, even in a time of crisis, especially in a time of crisis, keep the banks open, right? So that's going to be why he comes up with the Federal Reserve. That is his answer to that. And the Federal Reserve would allow private banks to draw out loans from a federal fund when they find people trying to withdraw a lot of money and the bank is out of cash. So instead of closing that bank, they call up the Federal Reserve and they say, hey, I need some funds, and those are going to be sent over. Again, a loan, not like here you go on a platter, a loan to get through that tense economic time so we don't have bank closures and so we don't have an economic panic like we had the panic of 1893, okay? So the Federal Reserve Act is going to be passed in 1913. And when that is passed, again, it's a central fund from which banks can borrow money to prevent an economic collapse, especially during times of panic. The whole point is to have a flexible money supply. The money doesn't get stuck anywhere, it doesn't get clogged anywhere, it keeps moving, people keep spending, people, again, feel good about the economy, so they spend, right? And it's a gross analogy, but it's kind of like a plumber. That's what the Federal Reserve does. Get the clogs out, keep things moving, right? So it has 3 tiers. Think about it like a layer cake. That smallest tier, that little cute cake on top, that's going to be a board of officials. And the board of officials is going to be elected by the president, or appointed rather, by the president, chosen, and they are in charge of running this whole system. Clearly you need people who know something about money, how it works, money theory, inflation, all the stuff we've been talking about. The second tier, a slightly bigger part of that layer cake, the second tier is going to be the 12 federal banks. And these 12 federal banks are going to then give to the biggest tier, that bottom of the cake, which are private banks. So the 12 federal banks are going to then channel those funds to those private banks. And of course, the private banks serve you and me, the people, right? So that's going to be how our national banking system isn't quite like the national bank it was, but is under national supervision. And this is huge because we have never before had something that intervenes in the lives of people and their private banking. So this is enormous when you have the Federal Reserve created like this. So keep that in mind, and we're going to continue to look at that. When they do their job, they stop economic panics. When they don't, we get the Great Depression, and we're going to talk about exactly what they do and why they are lacking and slacking on the job, and that's a part of, not all of, but a part of the Great Depression happening. The next piece that Woodrow Wilson is going to do is, of course, the antitrust laws. So again, so far, Woodrow Wilson has made possible, officially ratified the 16th Amendment under Taft, right? It was Taft's idea, but now we've totally ratified it. He has the tariff lowered and the 16th Amendment, which is income tax. He has the Federal Reserve Act passed, and now we have his antitrust laws. So we know that Teddy Roosevelt brought back Sherman antitrust law. He's going to make it really tough and buff and, you know, getting into those loopholes. But Wilson and Congress decide we need a whole new antitrust law because that one has way too many loopholes, and you see people still getting around it. It's not being enforced like it should. So he is going to pass his version, which is the Clayton Antitrust Act. And the Clayton Antitrust Act was passed in 1914. I think of it like a meaner, leaner version of the Sherman Antitrust Act. It extends on the Sherman Antitrust Act, so there's more of it, and it also clarifies it. It says exactly what it means, when it means. That means loopholes for the people like JP Morgan, not going to happen anymore. And it supports workers. It supports workers in their right to go on strike, to picket, to boycott, to bargain collectively, which is really interesting. We know when we have a pretty controversial law, like the Interstate Commerce Act, you often need that muscle behind it. Do you like that? Yeah. You need that muscle behind it to make sure that this law is enforced. And that's why we know we have the Interstate Commerce Act and then the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission. Very similar here. You have the Clayton Antitrust Act, and then to make sure that the Clayton Antitrust Act is followed, he comes up with the FTC, and that stands for Federal Trade Commission. So the Federal Trade Commission is passed in 1915, and it's going to enforce these antitrust laws, make sure they are followed, crack down on deceptive advertising, which is interesting, and you and I live here today. That's why at the end of those ads, when they're like, your life will be so much better with this pill, it'll fix everything, and then they're like, side effects may include diarrhea, and you may die tomorrow, and a terrible, That's because of the FTC. They make sure that there's no deceptive advertising. You can't dupe the consumer. You can't fool us outright. Of course, it still happens all the time, but that's that law put in place. It also investigates businesses. So sometimes it would look at them and say, what's going on here? Are you allowing unions? Is this okay? And of course, the boss would say, yeah, yeah, yeah. So instead, they go to the worker and they're like, psst, are you actually allowed to have unions? Are you being treated well? Is that what's going on? They investigate and make sure that's happening. So this is awesome that this is going on, right, for rights of workers and everything else. But who does Woodrow Wilson put in charge of the FTC? But really big business sympathizers. So that's totally counterintuitive, right? Why would you have that? Why would you have people who run it do that? It's like putting a KKK member in charge of the NAACP. I know that's an extreme example, but they're never going to turn in their own. So this is great in theory, but at the end of the day, lots of guys in the FTC are not going to turn in their cronies and their friends. So how this is effectively enforced is going to be, right? And then we turn to Woodrow Wilson with minority rights. And we're going to talk a lot and have talked a lot about his track record with women. It is obviously not fantastic, even though officially in his administration, you do see the 19th Amendment passed and you do see women get the right to vote in 1920. He is not a supporter of this, especially early on. Once the tides start to really get behind women, especially after World War I, when women have done so much to support this war effort, and it would be pretty unpopular of him not to support it, he inches over. But he is the reason that Lucy Burns and Alice Paul get arrested and get, sent to prison and force-fed and beaten. It is terrible, and he gives that order. He does not want them there. So we have to remember that because, once it's popular, okay, he delivers some speeches, but he is not a supporter of women getting the right to vote. And of course, it's them picketing outside the White House with his order that gets them arrested. But again, after World War I, can't ignore it any longer, and then he says, okay. And it's really not through him, it is through our Congress members, et cetera, that we see the 19th Amendment passed in 1920. What about African Americans and Woodrow Wilson? Lots of people in the federal government historians, et cetera, will say it's under Woodrow Wilson that we see a re-segregation of the federal government. And there are terrible stories about people having even like specific workplaces that were almost like a telephone booth or like pretty much looked like a cage inside a lot of these federal offices because you might be the only black worker, so they're not going to create a whole new office space for you. You have to work with everyone there, and they would just like section you off. How much we can exactly point to Woodrow Wilson and say, this is your fault, you made this happen, and how much this is just, again, the tentacles of the Jim Crow South reaching even to our nation's capital is unclear. But Woodrow Wilson, again, is from the South, and he's from the South at a time that is very distinct. He is going to continue to deny any passage of anti-lynching laws. So the NAACP at this time is really active trying to get anti-lynching laws passed. No, that is not going to happen at this time. And in his term, interracial marriage in our nation's capital becomes a felony. So none of these things reflect well on Woodrow Wilson. And again, in the absence of advocating and in the absence of saying, no, we shouldn't pass those laws, they're wrong, this is support. Staying quiet, as Martin Luther King always reminds us, is often one of the worst things we can do. And at the end of the day, Woodrow Wilson is sadly in support of a lot of these policies, which is why we talked in class, what do you do with Princeton's public policy program that is named after him? What do you do with these buildings that have his name? Do we take the name off? Do we learn from it? Do we have plaques? Do we look at the context of it and how complex it is? I think that's really where a lot of it lies, but lots of controversy surrounding him. And you have Teddy Roosevelt, who invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House. And then you have someone like Woodrow Wilson, and you can see just where somebody's loyalties lie, right? Wilson is just in his lack of action, his lack of legislation, and also allowing that bad legislation to take place, which is very racist, is quite against minority groups. And again, in my opinion, and I know you're really supposed to have your own thoughts, so I'll just tell you this is my opinion, you don't have to share it. Woodrow Wilson is not small p progressive. He may be in the capital P progressive era, but he is not what we would call a progressive president. He is actually quite sexist and racist. But at the end of the day, we don't often remember this about Woodrow Wilson because we just remember what happens with World War I. And this is a classic case of, these programs, all this stuff, not really remembered as much because once World War I rolls in, it is guns over butter. We are spending on the military and these social programs slide, and the progressive era is going to be over. So most people remember that about Woodrow Wilson, not his domestic policy. And again, so many good things that he's going to do, Princeton University, his role there when he was president, all these things. And yet the way he treats women and the way he treats African Americans is severely, severely lacking in both respect and action. So, as always, very complex presidents of ours and individuals, and we will talk much more about the coming of World War I and this Guns Over Butter, and again, how with the coming of World War I, the progressive era is over, because we never quite have enough money to both support social programs and a war. And between the two, we classically always choose war. All right, you guys, that's it for Woodrow Wilson's domestic policy, and I will see you later.